The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as lawyers shuffled papers and reporters whispered to one another. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across polished wood floors. Just then, Officer Ronan Kessler entered. He was a broad-shouldered man in a crisp blue uniform, his boots clicking on the floor with deliberate authority. Heads turned as he strode toward the bench, his posture rigid and confident. At the center of the room stood Judge Meridian Cross. In her 60s, she carried herself with calm assurance. As she smoothed the lapel of her robe, her eyes met Kessler's unflinching stare. He paused, the faint echo of his boots fading. Then with a cruel sneer, he spat, "You people are all the same," and took a step forward, voice dripping with disdain. Before we continue, we'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us get closer to 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us. Thank you so much. A sudden hush fell. Jurors sat straight in their seats. Clerks froze at their desks. Spectators held their breath. Not one bystander interrupted or reached out to stop him. All at once, the courtroom felt too small for the tension in the air. Kessler's words hung heavy, daring anyone to challenge him. In that charged silence, it was clear a showdown was coming. He believed his badge made him untouchable. She was about to prove otherwise. Judge Cross's hand rested firmly on the edge of the bench as she absorbed Officer Kessler's insult. Her gaze held steady, unflinching. After a heartbeat, she tilted her head ever so slightly and asked, "My place?" The question was soft, yet carried in each deliberate syllable a challenge he could not ignore. Kessler squared his shoulders and leaned in the very picture of a man convinced of his own supremacy. He barked back, voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "I take orders from no one, especially not someone like you." His words rang out crisp and brash, as though authority itself resided in his badge and uniform. Silence enveloped the room once more. Pens paused mid-scratch. Witnesses stared. Even the rustle of turning pages seemed an intrusion. Solemn eyes flicked between the unyielding judge and the defiant officer, each waiting to see who would yield. Then, without warning, the great wooden doors at the back swung open. The bailiff's voice cut through the hush. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Meridian Cross." In that instant, Kessler's swagger faltered. His smirk slipped away as everyone, jurors, attorneys, spectators, sprang to their feet. Judge Cross rose with quiet grace. She stepped forward past Kessler, her robe brushing the polished floor, and mounted the bench. With a measured motion, she settled into her chair and placed her gavel before her. The room shifted. The balance of power had tipped. No longer was Kessler the unquestioned authority in the room. He was the one beneath her gaze, awaiting her command. In the span of a breath, the man who believed himself above scrutiny found himself squarely under it. Silence pressed down like a physical weight the moment Kessler registered his mistake. He had dared to insult the judge, whose gavel carried the force of the law. You could have heard a pin drop. The courtroom, full of lawyers, jurors, witnesses, and observers, all sat frozen. Every heartbeat seemed magnified as they processed what had just happened. Judge Cross did not rush. She allowed that pregnant pause to linger, her posture, unchanging, her gaze steady on Kessler. In that quiet, her years of service as a prosecutor and public defender spoke louder than any outburst ever could. Her stillness was a statement. She was no stranger to confrontation, and she would not be cowed. The tension hummed in the air as Cross drew a slow, deliberate breath, ensuring that every person in the gallery felt the full gravity of the moment. Then, with unerring precision, she brought her gavel down in a single sharp crack. The sound split the silence like lightning. It was an unmistakable declaration of authority. Kessler's broad chest heaved visibly as if he had been punched. For the first time in his career, perhaps the first time ever, he looked uncertain. His confident veneer cracked, revealing the shock of a man who realized he was no longer untouchable. Around him, observers exchanged quick glances. Some looked relieved, others looked awed. They knew they had borne witness to a turning point, the moment when unchecked power collided with unwavering justice and lost. In that charged instant, the balance of the courtroom shifted forever. Kessler, once accustomed to commanding every room he entered, was reduced to a man who had to answer to the law and to a judge who refused to back down. After a second resonant strike of the gavel, Judge Cross looked up and addressed her deputy. "Bring forward the first motion. Officer Kessler, you are held in contempt." A ripple of astonishment swept the courtroom. Spectators leaned forward as the deputy unholstered a pair of handcuffs and approached Kessler. The once indomitable officer whose uniform had long shielded him from scrutiny stood suddenly vulnerable. He glanced from the gleaming cuffs to the judge's unflinching gaze, his confidence draining away. The metal closed around his wrists with a crisp click that sounded unnervingly final. Gasps filled the air as Kessler's shoulders slumped and his head dipped in silent acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Clerk and counsel alike exchanged stunned looks. Never before had they seen a man of his rank so swiftly stripped of his power. The deputy then spoke with solemn clarity. "Officer Ronan Kessler, you have abused your office in this courtroom. Submit to the court's authority as you are hereby detained." Kessler offered no resistance. He shuffled forward each footfall, echoing against the polished floor, like distant thunder as the weight of the steel cuffs reminded him that in justice's domain no badge provides immunity. The spectators watched in tense silence, some leaning toward the doors, as if expecting an aftershock. Children who had been allowed to sit in the gallery perched on the edge of their seats. Seasoned attorneys paused mid-note, and reporters leaned against their notebooks in disbelief. All eyes were on the ex-officer as he passed a man once synonymous with authority, now reduced to a single handcuffed figure. Judge Cross remained motionless behind her bench, her expression inscrutable. She waited until Kessler had walked through the double doors and their brass handles swung shut behind him. Only then did she return her attention to the stack of paperwork before her, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. In that quiet moment, the courtroom understood the law commands respect above all else, and no uniform, no matter how crisp or proud, can place a person above its reach. The moment the double doors swung shut behind Officer Kessler, the hush in the courtroom spilled into the corridors outside. A ripple of astonished whispers rose among the crowd. "Did you see that she actually had him arrested?" Reporters jostled for a better angle. Microphones and cameras thrust forward as they vied to capture the first reactions. Longtime residents who had come to watch the trial stood shoulder to shoulder with newcomers, a mix of people wiping tears and others clenching their jaws in satisfied vindication. At the counsel's tables, both prosecutor and defense attorney sat frozen for a heartbeat, exchanging stunned glances, as if replaying the scene in their minds. Then the prosecutor caught Judge Cross's clerk's eye and gave a subtle nod. The clerk rose and announced court is adjourned until further notice. The bailiff moved through the rows with practiced calm, ushering spectators out, first the jurors, then families, then reporters, each group departing with that charged energy of having witnessed a once-in-a-career display of judicial authority. Conversation buzzed everywhere. Phrases like unforgettable, powerful, and justice served punctuated the air. Once the last of the gallery had filtered past, Judge Cross rose from the bench. She paused in the doorway, the empty courtroom stretching behind her in post-trial silence. Cameras still clicked in the hallway, but within that threshold she stood alone for a moment. She looked past her clerk and clerk's assistant to where Kessler had stood handcuffed, and allowed her gaze to carry the weight of every word she had spoken, every pound of the gavel she had brought down. There was no triumphant smile, no vanquishing glare, only a quiet certainty that the law, not the badge, reigned supreme. Then, without a backward glance, she stepped out into the corridor, the courtroom doors sealing behind her. In that sudden stillness, the halls themselves seemed to inhale, absorbing the enormity of what had just occurred, a reminder that justice, when rightly served, transforms every space it passes through. Word of Officer Kessler's arrest rippled through the news cycle with astonishing speed. Within hours, clips of his handcuffed departure and Judge Cross's commanding gavel strike were all over social media. Courtroom justice and law above badge began trending, shared by lawyers, activists, and everyday citizens alike. Advocates hailed Cross's decisive action as a landmark affirmation that no one, even a decorated officer, stands above the law. Civil rights groups used the footage as evidence of systemic flaws in police accountability, sharing side-by-side comparisons of other unchecked abuses. Meanwhile, critics of overzealous judiciary powers decried the spectacle, arguing that the judge had humiliated a man in uniform. Opinion columns and broadcast panels debated whether the contempt charge had been warranted or merely theatrical. But amid the clamor, a quieter narrative took shape, one about the fragility of authority. Back in her chambers, Judge Cross sat alone, behind a towering wooden desk, its surface scattered with case files and legal texts. The soft glow of her desk lamp highlighted a hint of fatigue in her eyes. She traced the grain of the gavel, that simple, weighty tool that had toppled Kessler's arrogance, and felt the full measure of her responsibility. The courtroom had cheered her power, but she knew that power once misused could vanish as swiftly as it was granted. She reflected on the delicate balance she maintained each day, the need to respect law enforcement while safeguarding citizens' rights. She considered the families whose faith in justice had been shaken by past abuses, and the officers who served honorably yet feared being tarred by every scandal. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the courthouse, yet the gavel's echo lingered in her mind, a reminder that true accountability relies on steady hands and unwavering principles. In those quiet moments, Cross reaffirmed her vow to wield her authority not for spectacle, but to fortify the checks and balances that uphold justice, even when doing so unsettles entrenched power. 1 week later, City Hall's grand steps were lined with reporters and residents eager for answers. Behind the podium, police leadership announced they had launched a comprehensive internal review of Officer Kessler's actions. They pledged mandatory sensitivity and de-escalation training for all officers to restore public confidence. On either side, city council members spoke of healing community bonds and renewing trust in our justice system. Yet as cameras rolled, community activists stood just off stage with placards reading, "Independent oversight now" and "Transparency or bust." They called for genuine accountability, a civilian review board empowered to investigate misconduct, publicly accessible dashboards showing investigation outcomes and real penalties when officers abuse their authority. Editorial pages across the region carried editorials urging measured reform. Some columnists labeled Kessler's arrest an unfortunate anomaly, arguing that most officers served honorably and feared that broader reforms might undermine morale. Others countered that a system that permits even one unchecked abuse is itself broken, and pointed to decades of unaddressed complaints. Town halls grew heated as longtime residents and law enforcement families weighed in, debating whether Kessler's quick handcuffing marked a rare overstep or a necessary reckoning. Throughout the week, Judge Cross's courtroom remained conspicuously quiet. She offered no public commentary, preferring to let her ruling speak for itself. Inside the halls of justice, though, her decision became a touchstone. Lawyers cited her contempt order in bail review hearings. Police trainers replayed the handcuffing scene as a case study in the limits of authority. Local pastors and civic leaders invoked her name when urging congregations and neighborhoods to hold public servants to their oaths. In the end, the moment was no longer just about one officer or one judge. It had sparked a broader conversation. How and by whom should power be wielded? Who stands watch when traditions of deference go too far? And perhaps most urgently, how do communities ensure that no one is truly untouchable under the law? Judge Cross's gavel had cracked through more than wood. It had cracked open a vital public debate. By the fall semester, Judge Cross's decisive moment had taken on a life of its own in legal education. Across the country, law professors paused their lectures to show students the video of Kessler's contempt hearing. They unpacked how her steady, calm, commanding presence and respect for due process transformed a tense encounter into a landmark lesson on the balance of power. Meanwhile, back at City Hall and police headquarters, the ripples of that gavel strike had not yet settled. Officer Kessler found himself navigating a series of disciplinary hearings. His once proud uniform now hung untouched in a locker, and his badge sat in an evidence bin. Civil lawsuits followed. Families who had suffered from past abuses came forward, citing Cross's ruling as the turning point that made them believe their voices would finally be heard. For survivors of police overreach, Judge Cross's order was more than courtroom drama. It was vindication. They saw in her ruling a promise that no one, regardless of rank or uniform, stood above the law. Community support groups formed, using her example to train citizens in knowing their rights and speaking up when officers crossed the line. Within the police force, sentiments were mixed. Some officers bristled, viewing the ruling as a betrayal of solidarity. Others quietly acknowledged it was a necessary reminder a badge is not a shield against accountability. Recruiting officers began to emphasize community engagement and ethics training, citing Cross's courtroom as the moment they learned that authority must always answer to justice. In city council chambers and neighborhood meetings, the phrase "responsibility, not immunity" became a rallying cry. Local leaders pointed to the case to argue for lasting reforms, transparent complaint processes, clear use of force guidelines, and stronger civilian oversight. Judge Cross herself returned to her docket cases of custody disputes, contract disputes, civil rights claims, her evenings spent quietly reviewing briefs rather than seeking the spotlight. But her influence endured. On law school exam questions and bar review materials, and in the whispered advice of veteran judges to new clerks, her name was now shorthand for a vital truth. Courage and principle, wielded at just the right moment, can bend the arc of justice toward accountability. Every morning, Judge Cross entered her chambers and glanced at a single word pinned above her desk: accountability. It reminded her that justice is not a one-time act, but a daily responsibility. After the Kessler case, her mailbox overflowed with letters, some filled with heartfelt thanks, others laced with thinly veiled threats. Still, she did not waver. As news of her ruling spread, witnesses who once spoke in hushed tones found their voices. Victims of misconduct came forward, ready to testify under oath and break the cycle of silence. In courtrooms from coast to coast, their courage fueled new convictions and policy changes. On the first anniversary of Kessler's contempt citation, neighborhoods organized peaceful gatherings outside courthouses. Banners declaring "no one above the law" fluttered in autumn breezes. Clergy veterans and families joined hands reciting the pledge that laws are meant to protect the vulnerable first. These commemorations were neither rallies nor protests in the conventional sense. They were quiet affirmations that power without accountability is nothing more than tyranny. City councils introduced resolutions celebrating justice with compassion and pledged regular reviews of police conduct. State bar associations added modules on implicit bias and courtroom authority to continuing education requirements for judges and attorneys. Law enforcement agencies rolled out new training on de-escalation and respect for civil rights. For ordinary citizens, the ripple effects were profound. Community watch groups learned to document interactions with officers, knowing their recordings could matter. Neighborhood associations held forums on legal rights and the role of oversight boards. In living rooms and senior centers, people shared stories of the Kessler hearing, reminding one another that a single judge's quiet firmness had rekindled their faith in democracy. Judge Cross returned day after day to her docket: family disputes, small claim suits, civil rights appeals. Her work now carried out under an unspoken promise that every person, regardless of who they are or what they wear, deserves equal protection under the law. In those chambers, accountability was more than a word. It was a covenant she honored with each decision she made. Years after that dramatic day in court, Judge Cross's ruling has become more than a footnote in legal textbooks. It is a living example of how steadfast courage can realign the scales of power. In Birmingham, law enforcement agencies now proactively publish annual reports on officer conduct, complete with complaint statistics and discipline outcomes. Civilian oversight boards, once a rare experiment, convene every quarter, inviting community members to review policy changes and hear testimony from both officers and citizens alike. New training protocols have replaced aggressive tactics with de-escalation techniques, teaching officers to pause, listen, and respect constitutional rights before drawing their weapons or making arrests. Recruit classes study the Kessler case as a mandatory lesson in humility and restraint, learning that authority granted by a badge carries an obligation to serve, not to dominate. Across the state, city councils have passed resolutions endorsing transparency, first requiring every police department to install body-worn cameras on patrol and to make footage available to the public upon request. Universities offer courses on judicial ethics that highlight Judge Cross's example, how a single gavel strike can echo far beyond one courtroom and spark systemic change. Community groups empowered by the memory of that moment remain vigilant. Neighborhood watch meetings now include legal briefings on citizens' rights, and church congregations host Know Your Rights workshops. Veterans and retirees gather annually to commemorate the anniversary of Kessler's contempt citation, not with protest, but with a solemn pledge to uphold the rule of law by speaking out whenever it is abused. The true legacy of that day is not found in Kessler's downfall, but in the quieter shift that followed, when every branch of government, every badge, and every robe learned that no individual stands above the law. Because when justice holds steady and accountability is non-negotiable, the promise enshrined in our Constitution endures for all. This story reminds us of the personal responsibility We all share in the fight against racism. Every public act of speaking out, every story we share helps shift community awareness. The message is simple. No one can stand on the sidelines because silence in the face of injustice equals complicity. Now, I want to hear from you. How did that courtroom experience impact your perspective? Do you believe bias training and independent oversight are strong enough to prevent abuse of power, or do we need additional safeguards? Please comment below and share your personal viewpoint. When do you think racism will truly end? Will future generations avoid our mistakes? Is it a long journey requiring education, policy reform, and cultural change? Or will a single symbolic event spark real transformation? Each of your responses will help expand the essential dialogue we need so we can learn together, progress together, and build a society free of racial barriers.